Well, good morning, everyone. Today is Friday, August the 7th, 2015, and this is WxLive webinar number 159. And today's webinar is being brought to us by Uncle Pete. He's going to be talking about WebDev date entry control templates. It's all yours, Pete.
All right. Morning, everyone. As I said in my little blurb about what this week's about, date entry controls are boring. Pop-up calendars are cumbersome and have some issues. And then they even get more confusing when you start talking about multi-language, because those folks over on the other side of the Atlantic don't know that you're supposed to do month day. They think you're supposed to do day month. So when you're doing a multilingual app, it really gets confusing working with dates and date controls, because there's always a question of which format you're displaying in, and just a lot of issues with them. So for all of those reasons, in a recent project, I decided we needed a much nicer, cleaner, very obvious date control to go with the site. And that's what we're looking at today, is what I wound up creating. So we're going to do two things today. We're going to look at the actual date control I created, but more importantly, we're going to take a kind of a look at control templates and how you use them and how you create them, because as you'll see, control templates are pretty handy, pretty powerful things that let you, you could do all of this stuff on each page that you need it on, but by creating a control template, you have a nice, concise thing that you can just drop on your page and use. So it's kind of a way for you to create your own entry type controls and so forth. If there's some piece of your interface that you've created custom that you use in multiple places, you can create that as a control template and then reuse it everywhere. And the real nice part about that is if you decide to make a change to that by changing the control template, that change makes it everywhere throughout your site. So there's a lot of advantages to control templates. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. There's just a little bit of custom CSS in this, but for the most part, we're looking at pure WX code today. So we're not getting too fancy into code at all. So it's really more about just being able to create and use a control template. So we'll start by, as you see, I've actually got two different control templates. I've got one for displaying, and all it is a cell. That's what gives us the border and the light blue background, and then three statics, one across the top for the month and year, one in the center for the day, and then one at the bottom for the day of the week. And that's what I turn into a control template, so that I don't have to have those four individual controls and all the code related to them on each page. I just have one control that is the control template. And then we also have an editable version of the same control, and all it is I've added 4 links so that I can increase a day. And my code's not. Oh, I'm doing months there. Oh, that's strange. Okay. We can do a day or a month, either forward or backwards. So that's what we're looking at is, and this control template, instead of recreating the 4 pieces that make the display, I actually use the first control template in the second control template. The advantage to that is, once again, we make a change to that display template, it'll propagate down to the edit template, and again, I'm only making a change in one place. So that's what we're looking at today. You know, here's the boring, good old-fashioned edit control and pop-up calendar. You tell me which one's more attractive. All right, so we'll start with how do you use the control template first. We'll kind of cover that, then we'll actually look at creating it and using it. Once you've created your control template, it lives over in the Project Explorer, templates of web controls, and you just grab it and drop it on the screen. And you'll notice the little yellow dots. That's how you know this is coming from a control template. And you can override the individual pieces. We've shown you that stuff before. We don't need to do any of that for this particular template. So that's how you get your template onto your page once you've created your template. Now, the first thing I should mention is, as we're selecting this, if you look down in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see the name of the control you have selected. And this gets folks sometimes, because the first time I select it, you'll see I'm actually selecting the template. The second time I select it, well, it's not doing it today. Sometimes when you try to select it, it'll select the cell instead of the template. So sometimes you'll wind up with the description and the embed point not being what you want. So you just have to make sure you really get the template selected. And the first thing I do when I drop a control template onto a page is I rename it. You notice that WinDev names it TPO Control Template 1, which is incredibly useful. So the first thing I'll do is go into the description of the template, and then I'll name it template arrival date or something, that so I know what date this template is really dealing with. So that's the first thing to remember to do when you're dealing with templates. So once we have the template on the page, using it is pretty simple. All we do, this one here is, if we click on it, we'll see that it's named Template Block Date Display. And all I'm doing is I'm creating a date control and making it 7 days into the future. And then I just sent the template value, so template block date display equals temp date. So all I'm doing is setting the value of the template to the date that I want to display. And by simply doing that, I get my date displayed. So that's all there is to actually using the template. Now, the one nice feature that I wish they would add, and I'm kind of surprised that you can't, and maybe you can, maybe Wolfgang knows something I don't, is what would really be nice is if I could link this to a variable the same as you can other edit controls. But the link tab of the description screen is disabled, so I can't get to that. So I have to move the value in and out via code instead of linking it and being able to use page this file and file the page. I haven't really researched that to know that if there is a way or not, but my guess is that control templates just don't support linking, but it sure would be a nice feature if they were to add it. So now that's how you use the control template. Now let's actually talk about creating a control template. Well, there's two ways to create a control template. You can create one from scratch by simply coming over here to the Project Explorer where Templates of Web Controls is, right-click, and choose New Control Template. When you do that, You start with a blank one, and it's just like editing a page. From here, you just drop your controls on, do your coding, whatever you need to do, and now you have a control template. Can't get to the little X to close that. Get out of here. Okay, so that's the first way you can do it. Now, what I generally do instead is I create the controls that are going to be my control template. And let me just copy these guys over. The easiest way to do it. And this is exactly how I originally created this one. I started by getting all of this to work. You know, I created my individual statics. You see my 3 different statics and my cell. And once I get it to work as actual controls on a page, then all I have to do is select all those controls and then come up to the Modification tab, go to Refactoring and Swapping, and choose Create a Control Template from the selection. And when you do that, it creates a control template, wants to know what you want to call it, and it creates the control template. And at the same time, had I went through all those screens, it would have turned this into a reference to that control template. In other words, I would have came back and these would have had yellow dots on them. So that's the other way that you can create a control template. Either way, once you've created your control template, it's now over here and you can simply edit it, same as editing a page. You've got all the controls that you can drop on it. You've got embed code, what they call processes, and this is all the code of our template, and that's the next thing we're going to look at. This is absolutely every bit of the code. The first thing you'll see is I'm declaring a local variable. It's in the global declarations, but it's the global declarations of this template. So in other words, this variable is only available within the template. It's not global to the page. So anywhere within the template, now I can refer to date, and that's a date variable. So I declared that variable that's going to be global for the template. Then in the initialization code, I call a local procedure. Again, that procedure only exists within this template called display date. And that's going to display, update my 3 statics. So let's take a look at that code real quick for display date. Nothing earth-shattering here. I'm using the WX function date to string to do all this. And the really nice thing about this is this code is all multilingual. It handles whatever language you happen to be logged on, because date to string automatically handles all that. So the first line, I'm getting that month, 3-character month, which when you use the capital M, 2 small m's, for whatever reason, it puts a period at the end of it. I don't like that period. I don't want AUG period. I just want AUG. So then I'm using the replace function to get rid of that period, making it an empty space. So that removes the period. So that's how I'm getting the month with the date to string, and then I'm just tacking on the year onto the end of it. So that's my first static, month, year. Then the day, I just use the day property of the date field to get that. And then finally the day of the week. Again, date to string has a function that will do that for me and makes it multilingual and all those great and wonderful things. I don't have to do any of that coding. So I'm using that same type function, and again, it's putting that period on the end that I need to get rid of. So that's all the display code. That's updating my 3 statics. So far, we haven't seen anything that's just not code that we use every day of our lives. The next 2 pieces are the things that make control templates different. When you create a control template, you get these 2 extra processes: retrieving the value property and assigning through the value property. If you've worked with classes, and especially if you worked with properties, when you create a property of a class, you have a retrieving and an assignment process that you can set up. If you're coming from a Newt world, a .NET world, you've heard them referred to as setters and getters. It's the same thing. So anytime someone retrieves the value, references the value of the template, this code in the retrieving is going to be fired. And anytime they set the template to a value, this code's going to be fired. So then if we look at this code, it's pretty straightforward. Anytime any of my code tries to look at the value of the template, all I'm doing is doing myself .value equals loc date, my date. So that means anytime any code looks at the value of the value of the template is going to be our local date variable. Then on the assignment side, so anytime someone sets the template to a value, I do that exact same type thing, just the opposite. I set our local, excuse me, I set our local variable, loc date equals myself.value, which myself in this instance is referring to the template. So whatever value you just set the template to, I'm going to set my local date variable to that value, and then I'm going to call the display date function. So that's the reason why when we were over looking at this code, when we do template block date display equals temp date, that fired this code and set the local date equals that value, and then did a display to update our 3 statics. And we can actually take a look at that in the debugger and see that actually happen. Now, one other thing I should mention, templates, and this one still trips me up occasionally. You feel like you should be able to come over here and put the debugger here, but this code is only reference code. It actually puts a copy of that code in your page, and you'll notice how it's grayed out. I can't change this code. To change this code, I have to overload the code and do those type of things. But this is the code that came from the template, and that's where I need to set my debugger break, is on the actual code inside the page, not the code over here. It'd be real nice if they would translate that over, because there's times where I may have several instances of the template, and if I could put the break in the template itself, life would be a little easier. But instead, I have to make sure to put it on the page. So now let's actually not do it there. Let's do it here and see how it goes. Okay, so we're going to issue this command. So now when we step line by line, we see that it's firing the assignment through value, and this is local one that we could override, but it also has a command in it that says execute ancestor, which means execute whatever code came from the template. and that's where it's now going to set loc date equals the value of the template. And if I hover over the myself.value, you see that it's 2015-08-14 because that's what temp date was, and we set the value of the template equals to the value of temp date. Now we're setting loc date equal that value, and then we're just going to display date, which executes those 3 lines, and voila, we get our date display. It actually popped up on another screen. So that's how that code's working. Now, because this one's only a display version, you know, retrieving the value probably doesn't make a lot of sense, but I went ahead and put all the bits and pieces here because we're going to eventually create a edit version off of this. So I just went ahead and put all the logic in place so that it could handle either way. So that's all there is to displaying, and we've already looked at how we would then use this display template. Before we get into the edit version, do we have any questions on the display version?
There's no questions out here yet.
Awesome. All right, so now the display version, as we discussed, is just the addition of 4 different links for -1 month, minus a day, plus 1 day, plus a month. It's just 4 links. And then as you see, the display portion, I actually drop the template onto this template. So when, just like when you're dealing with a page, when you create a template, you can create a template, then you can drop other templates onto that template. So you can build your templates up. And the real advantage of that is, like I said, if I decide that I'm using this template on a site that, you know, we decide our color scheme is not going to be blue, it's going to be green, all I have to do is come in and modify the styles for this display one, and those will then update the template for the edit one. So all of my logic is only exists in one place, which is, you know, the real power of using control templates and classes and all those things that we do, is so that we don't have to maintain code in multiple places. So as I said, we've just got 4 links here. If we look at the code of those links, nothing real earth-shattering. All they're doing is incrementing the date by either 1 day or 1 month, and then calling display. But the one thing that you will notice, and before we get there, I should mention, remember I said when I drop a control template, I always name it something that makes sense so that it's not called template control template 1. Same thing, when I drop this control template on, I named it template display date. That way my code that we're getting ready to look at doesn't say template control template 1, which doesn't mean anything to anybody. Instead it says template display date. Remember when we were looking at the display template, I said that that local variable or that global variable and procedure were local to that template, which means that they really don't exist up at this level. But what WebDev does give us is the ability to reach down and reference variables at a lower level. So by prefixing our variable with the name of the template it's contained in, I'm able to reference that locdate variable even though it doesn't truly exist up at this level. So by putting the template display date period in front of it, I'm saying use that locdate that lives down in that other template. And the minus minus is just subtracting 1 day. And then same thing for display date, because that procedure lives in that template display date. I need to do the same thing. I need to prefix the call to my procedure the same way. So that's how you reference stuff that lives on a different page or a different template. Now, that there are some caveats to that, especially when you're dealing with pages and windows and so forth, is that page or window has to be open, otherwise that reference is going to fail because that variable doesn't exist at that point in time. But in this instance, the template does exist because we've added it to this template. So that's our 4 links. Nothing special about those as far as the code goes. And then you'll notice that we have the same retrieve and assignment variable or processes like we did before. And the reason I'm putting code in these is if I drop the edit template onto a page as a programmer, especially if I'm not the programmer that originally created the template, I don't want that developer to have to know, well, he should refer to the value of the display template. He should, he's going to think that he should just refer to the value of the edit template. So all I'm doing here is anytime you set the edit template to a value, I do, in the assignment one, I set that locdate equals to the value of this template. So when you set the value of the edit template, I set the value of the display template, which again is going to cascade. When I set the value of that display template, just like we saw a moment ago, it's going to fire the assignment code of the display and set the local variable and display it. And just the opposite, whenever we try to retrieve the value of the edit template, I'm going to set the value of the edit template equals the value of that local variable for the display. So that's how, if we come back over here, exact same code that we have for the display one, we do for the edit one. All we do is set the edit template equals temp date, and our edit template has that date. And then let me just quickly add a button here. And we'll do info. Can't do that. Okay, we'll have to do it on the server. So I've moved that edit template to October 14th, 2014. And when I hit the button, you see that when I look at the value of the edit template, indeed, that's what it says it is. And how that worked is, again, if we put some debugs in here, place to put in debug is we put a debug in right here. All we're doing is referring to value, but when we do, it fires the retrieving value from the edit template, which executes the ancestor code, which is the code from the template, which then sets the value equals to the template display log date, and that's how we get our October 14, 2015. And then the same is true, you know, both for the assignment and the retrieve. We're doing that exact same kind of thing of setting the underlying template, the nested template, whatever you want to call it, its value based on this template's value, and that's how all of our logic in that underlying template still fires, and I haven't had to duplicate any logic from one place to the other. So believe it or not, we have looked at all the WX code. So the only thing left is to go over a little bit of fancy CSS code. And you may have noticed that if we look at those links at runtime, they're just greater than and less than symbols. But when we do them at runtime, they're far more attractive. And I'm using a bit of CSS code to tweak their look. And a couple of reasons I'm doing that. I probably could have made life a little easier on myself by just creating a couple of graphics and using graphics to do this. But the site that I actually created this control for, we are doing both private labeling, which means that we need to support customization of all the colors based on what company you're logged in as. And we're also doing multilingual, which depending on what kind of graphic you're using means you need a graphic for each language. So you might wind up with a different graphic for each company and then multiple graphics for the languages. So we've taken the approach of any way possible we don't use graphics. We try as hard as we can to do everything with fonts and text and CSS. A side effect of that is, in theory, your page load time should be faster as well. I don't concern myself with that quite as much because for the most part I'm writing business apps that are being used where connections are fairly good. But if your target audience is an audience that may not have great connection speeds and those kind of issues, everything that you can do as CSS and fonts and versus graphics is definitely going to be better for you. So that's another side effect. So let's take a look at the style for these links and see what CSS code I did to make all this work. Okay, the first tab we're going to look at is the text tab. You'll notice that I'm using 20 pixels for the size. Generally, when I'm developing, I use points because, you know, I spent a previous life as a desktop publisher and think in points, and that's pretty much the way Word and everything else does. So points is kind of what my default mode is. However, by setting it to pixels instead, I have a lot more control because I'm saying it's precisely 20 pixels, and I know what 20 pixels means. You know, points is relative to a lot of other things, where pixels is always pixels. So I'm setting it to 20 pixels. The next thing that you'll see that's a bit different is I'm using this enter character setting, and I'm setting it to -11 pixels. Well, what is that? Enter character is the spacing between your characters. So this setting actually has no effect on our day links because they only have one character in them. But our 2 month links have 2 greater than or 2 less than symbols. And by default, the space between those is quite a bit when you're making 20 pixel characters. Well, I want to squeeze them real close together. So instead, I say make the spacing between them -11 pixels. What that's doing is squeezing the two together. So whatever their default spacing is, I'm making it 11 pixels less than what its default spacing would be. Next thing I'm doing is just setting the decoration to none, that so that I don't get an underline underneath my link. I don't want these to have an underline like a link normally would have. So that's the only unusual settings on this. Background and border I'm not doing anything with. Neither am I doing anything with shadow or margins. So the next stop is effects, and this is where we get a bit fancier, and I wish they would use the same terms that because this all translates to CSS code, and the terms in CSS are not enlargement Y. It's transformation scale. So they're using slightly different terms, which sometimes makes it a little harder to find where the settings on these screens are versus the CSS settings. And we're going to see some more of that here shortly. But regardless, what I'm setting here is I'm setting the Y scale to 200%. I'm leaving the X and Z because you can actually do 3D transformations. I'm not quite that fancy. That makes my head hurt, but what I'm doing is setting the Y-axis to 200%. So I'm stretching that font up. So I'm making a tall, skinny font instead of a normal size font. So that's how my greater than and less than, if you look at them, you can now see how they're squeezed in close together. That's because of the inner character spacing, and they're stretched out tall without getting wider. You know, if I had just made the font bigger, they would be both taller and wider. I don't want them wider, I just want them taller. I want them stretched out. So that's why I'm using the enlargement and doubling their height. Now we get into a few things that some of this may exist on some of these other tabs. I just don't know for sure where, and I do know how to do it via CSS code. So I just come into the custom CSS and put it in there. Now the disadvantage, anything that you put in the custom CSS, you don't see their effects in the page editor at design time. So that's part of the reason that our greater than and less than don't look the same at design time versus runtime. So I'll take you through these briefly. I'll give you the explanation that helped me get to where I needed to go. But you know, I'm not trying to teach you all the nuances of CSS. Google has plenty of resources for that. The first thing is the display mode. I'm setting to inline block. Anytime you start dealing with custom positioning and transformations and those sort of things, you are more than likely going to have to change your display mode to one of the block versions. And that's just so that everything on the page doesn't shift around. It basically lets your element that you're working with be free floating. Position relative is that same sort of thing. I'm saying that all my references to position are relative to its initial size, not to the positions of the page. So I'm not wanting to, reference 00 as the top left of the page. I want 00 to be the top left of the element I'm working with. Excuse me. Next is the index 1. That is more or less the equivalent of bring to foreground. If we have elements on top of each other, setting the Z index sets which one is on top of the other. And the reason we want to do that is if there's any overlapping, we want this element to take the click. If it's behind another element and it didn't have a Z index, it wouldn't get the click. So that's what that's about. The next two are a little bit of trickery because the one downside that I found to doing a transformation is it doesn't seem to affect the click area the same as it does the display area. So I got that nice stretched out greater than symbol, but not all of that greater than symbol would register a click. It was offset from the click area. So what I'm doing with the padding and the margins here is tweaking that click area. And what I'm doing is adding 10 pixels of padding, which basically makes my click area 10 pixels wider than what it normally is. But when I did that alone, then I wound up with my controls overlapping each other. So then I have to use a margin of 10 pixels negative to chop off the area. So I'm pushing it over and then chopping it off is the net effect of those two commands. And what I'm doing by doing all that is tweaking my click area. Now, if you think I just looked at this page and said, these are the settings I need, you have lost your mind. I ain't that good. What I did was play with trial and error and tweaking until I came up with these settings. And again, how I do all that tweaking, and we'll look at it in just a minute, is using the Chrome developer tools. I don't come in here and keep editing this code and running another test. That would be a nightmare. I use the Chrome developer tools to tweak these settings. And we'll take a quick look at that in just a second. But there's one last setting I need to show you. The only other thing we're doing, all four links share that exact same style that we just looked at. But then you'll notice in the plus month, if we look at the style for it, I have one overload, and that overload is an indent of -3 pixels. Well, what's that all about? Because this thing is right aligned, it's pushing all the controls to the right. So on the left-hand side, that squeezes everything together and makes my life good. But on the right-hand side, it winds up pushing my plus month over to the far right, and I wind up with a little too much space between my plus day and my plus month. So by setting a -3 pixel indent, I back up that greater than, that double greater than by 3 pixels to squeeze them back in close together. So I had to do one override to accomplish that. So now that we've looked at all those CSS settings, now let's take a look at, we'll run it in Chrome, and we'll look at the Chrome developer tools. We'll do an inspect element, and we'll start turning those settings off, and you can see how each one has an effect. The first thing to do is, let me find, if we turn off the padding and the margins, we'll see what my original problem was. As I highlight the link, you'll see it gets highlighted up on the page. So when I highlight the link, which is the anchor tag, you see that's my click area. So if anyone clicks anywhere other than right on that left-hand edge, so now I'm not getting clicks over in this area of that control. Notice how my cursor is not changing. So I have to click right over on that edge. So that's where the padding 10 comes in. But you see how the padding 10 actually made my controls, it added 10 pixels to the actual width of the control. So now my click area, you see the padding area is highlighted in green. The original click area is highlighted in blue. So now I've got the right area as click. So now all of this is click. Notice how my cursor is now correct. However, it pushed my controls too far apart, and that's because I've added 10 pixels to the width of my control. So that's where, by pulling that margin back in 10 pixels, so now my control's that wide, but I'm saying that you can overlap the margins and it lets everything overlap. And that's how I wind up with that precise click area. And same thing if we inspect this one. If we see that we've got the text indent of -3 pixels right there, that's that setting that we made, that we overloaded. If we turn that off, you'll see how we get a little too much spacing there and it doesn't look the same as this side. So that's what those 3 characters of text spacing are for there. So, and this is precisely how I wound up with the padding of 10 characters and so forth, is I just kept tweaking these settings because I can actually change this. And if I set this to 5, I can see that effect, and I see that, well, that's still not quite big enough. So all I did was keep tweaking these settings here until I got them perfect. Once I got them perfect, then I went into WebDev, made the changes to my style, and everything worked fine. So that's how we achieve tweaking those CSS settings, getting them exactly what we want. Now, if you're wondering how I came up with the inline and the relative and the z-index, I Googled, and found some examples of folks stretching fonts and doing similar things, and picked apart how and what they were doing, and got the basics of my settings. Then I just had to tweak the values to achieve what I wanted to achieve. And that's that's it. Like I said, along with having the data entry controls, hopefully this has kind of inspired you to take a look at control templates in general, because there are a lot of advantages to using control templates, and lets you once again create your app in a modular style.
So that's pretty impressive stuff, Pete.
I concur.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Especially the way that you use these Chrome development tools to help you find out exactly what settings you need to make in WebDev. It's really good stuff.
Yeah. Once I really learned how to do that, because trying to tweak those settings in WebDev and run another test, you're talking an hour of messing versus coming in here and just tweaking the actual setting and seeing its effect. It's much more efficient use of your time.
Right. And for those of you who this is the first of Pete's WebDev webinars that you've watched, you might want to go back and look at the past few that he's done. You'll see that he goes through these Chrome developer tools quite extensively to help him find out how to do some pretty amazing things with CSS.
Yeah, and I'm not pushing Chrome. Firefox has Firebug, and I'm sure some of the other browsers that will remain nameless to protect the guilty probably have some kind of tool as well. Chrome is the one I know and use.
I've been using Firefox's Firebug for a while before Chrome came along with an internal one. But both of them is pretty much got the same functionality. I wouldn't be surprised if they copied from each other at the end of the day.
No, I'm sure they developed it in a vacuum.
So there you go.
I prefer to refer to that as liberating design.
But then again, Pete, this time again you demonstrated not everything, if it doesn't go according to plan in WinDev or WX, is its problem there. It's got a lot to do with external factors to WinDev itself, WebDev actually, and that's things like this, the CSS style, etc. But
exactly. Yeah. I was really surprised that the transform didn't handle the click area better than what it does.
And it's not really WxLive's problem.
No.
WebDev's problem. It's all the way the styling happens in the browser and with the CSS. And there again, when people get upset about WebDev, many times when you look at it, it's got nothing to do with WebDev. It's everything to do with your CSS styling.
Exactly. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it over to you, Tim. You can kind of give us some updates on DevCon and so forth. This will be my last webinar before DevCon because I need to start prepping for DevCon. So if there's some other guys out there that can step up for the next few weeks leading up to DevCon, that would be great. I'm sure Andy's probably in the same boat as me. He's going to have to start prepping for DevCon very shortly as well. So if there's some of you other guys that have some stuff, and as you see, nothing I showed you today, other than a little bit of CSS, was anything earth-shattering at all. So by all means, I guarantee you, everyone listening has done some little trick that would be of benefit to all of us.
Yeah.
Right. And as Peter said, the DevCon is less than 60 days away now. So if you haven't yet signed up for it, now's your time. And if those of you who are watching this like the things that you've been seeing the last, well, how long has WxLive been going on now? A couple years now. If you like those sort of things, come on out and join us for the DevCon. Real high quality training. You can engage with the presenters one-on-one. You can also network with other developers, and I've had a number of people say that that they've wound up getting back more in knowledge and those sort of things from the DevCon that it cost them to come.
Yeah, it absolutely. It's more than just
I
the presentations. Just the being around like-minded people that are dealing with the same issues as you deal with every day. You'd be surprised the number of times that just a casual conversation at lunch will lead you to a breakthrough in something that you're working on because someone else just happens to mention something that they were trying to do and how they accomplished it. So, I probably bring back as much value out of that networking and those things as I do the actual presentations.
Yeah, most of the magic many times happens off stage.
Right.
Yeah, there's no way that you don't come home with more value than the cost. It's the best money you can invest in your WX development.
Yeah, well, thanks again, Pete. And for those of you all interested, go to www.wxdevcon.com. You can read all about the you can get your schedule on here. You can look at the topic descriptions. You can read a little bit about the presenters, and also you can register. And if you have any questions, just let us know. Thanks again, Pete. Thanks, Wolfgang. See both of you in Florida in October.
I will see you. Have fun in the meantime. Cheers.
Bye.